Your program says that the co-chairs will do two things. One is to highlight a few takeaway items, and secondly, to suggest some next steps, perhaps. And so let me take a first stab at a few reflections on takeaway items. As everybody went by my table at lunch, I singled out every fourth person and asked them what 2 or 3 things they would take away from the morning. And the ideas I liked, I put in here. So here are my 10 takeaway items from today, and you might have a different list, but we'll try to reflect the ideas that you've come up with in the final report. I heard today that learning outcomes can be your friend, but you might not want to call them learning outcomes at the beginning until you become better acquainted with them as friends. And then you may want to avoid the jargon, in fact, at the beginning and just get people engaged in describing academic outcomes for students in various programs. And in fact, the jargon, the language, can be a barrier to getting conversations going. I think that was important. Secondly, we're all here today because we care about student outcomes and experiences. Students need to understand their learning and explain what they've learned to others, including employers, other institutions, professional schools, and so on. And we didn't need to hear it. It was demonstrated today that students want to be and need to be full participants in our institutional and system-wide conversations about how to improve student learning. I think we had some remarkable student contributions to the forum today. And student feedback, as we've just heard, can be one of the best ways to get faculty buy-in and authentic reflection by faculty. A third takeaway item, the journey throughout learning outcomes takes time. And the journey is as important as the destination. This is not something we do once and move on. It's an ongoing process that has to be owned within an institution at all levels on an ongoing basis. Multiple measures over time are needed. We can start with things like course outline policies, new program development processes, cyclical program review processes, and so on. Fourth, the most important experts are right in our institutional backyards. And I think there's an implied challenge that's been given to the people in this room to play a crucial role in giving leadership, motivating, inspiring, involving, resourcing, providing incentives on campuses. But then fifth, back on those campuses, our campuses, to include resources such as those available in student affairs, student associations, teaching and learning centers, assessment experts, and to include external resources such as employers. Sixth, the articulation and assessment of learning outcomes is valuable in making academic decisions about resources, program change, future directions. I was watching lots of nodding heads this morning when you were giving your examples, Sandy, about the way these have rolled out at the University of Toronto. Outcome assessments, 7, needs to provide credible evidence of resources, implementation processes, and outcomes to improve effectiveness of instruction programs and higher education services. And I think Trudy has made the really important point that if we get that right at the institutional level, this sets us on the right path toward good outcomes at the system level. And that's very resonant, I know, with one of Campus Alberta Quality Council's core principles, and that is that the primary responsibility for quality assurance resides with institutions themselves. But we've heard from a number of individuals, and I think in a couple of compelling calls at the end of the day today, that for learning outcomes to be truly embedded in both quality assurance and transfer processes, there need to be, in addition to what happens at institutions, system-wide support and incentives that guide and support what happens at the institutional level. And I think this implies an important role for Campus Alberta Quality Council and ACAT in giving leadership to mutually determining with the system expectations for the use of learning outcomes in quality assurance and transfer. I heard from several individuals in the room at lunchtime that it can be very helpful for administrators within an institution to be able to say that there's an expectation that this will be done and that there's some accountability outside of the institution for doing it well. But then the councils that work with institutions do that in a manner that's truly co-determinative and respectful of what's happening within the institutions. Ninth, the assessment of student learning through tests of generic skills is not a valid way to compare institutional performance. Thank you, Trudy. And maybe finally, if you're not systematically doing all of this now, don't panic. A good starting point, we've heard, is to begin to roll this out with each new program that's being developed, with each upcoming cyclical program review, and assessment starts with the things you have and are currently doing in courses, and you can build out from there. So don't be afraid to work incrementally and take time to do it. So those are 10 takeaways that I have, and then let me just mention a couple of next steps and then turn it over to Robin for his thoughts. We had to limit participation today to 3 individuals from each institution, and I think that may be one of the reasons why we don't have as many faculty members as we might have here, and I think it would be helpful to have more faculty here. But there are lots of resources that will be available for you as primarily academic administrators here to initiate or continue this conversation at your own institution. We will be providing, first of all, there are the reports in the agenda that came as background reading. I think those would be rich resources to use back on your own campuses. There will be a report we've committed to generating from our forum today, along with the video records of the conversations. Please think carefully about how you might use these resources back on your own campuses to engage your full campus communities or particular programs or learning centers on your campus in this conversation. And you might think also about how you could pull together some key individuals from across institutions to support the work you're doing and share promising practices with each other. So that's one step to follow up. A second would be the survey. The survey will be one of the main instruments we have as a planning committee to guide us in thinking about how we can take your ideas for what to do next and to try to bring back to the system in some way some suggestions for follow-up initiatives. And one additional way that you might helpfully follow up on your own campus, and this is really just an announcement, the Council of Ministers of Education Canada, CMEC, has launched a pan-Canadian initiative to carry out a learning outcomes assessment questionnaire. And this will likely be coming to Alberta institutions soon. It will be completely voluntary, but it will gather data about how post-secondary institutions measure outcomes. And only aggregate data from this assessment would be sent to CMEC, and information gathered from the process will be shared with CMEC members and perhaps on a wider basis. So this is an opportunity to share what's happening at your institution at a national level, and then eventually to be able to get data information at an aggregate level about what's happening in the rest of Canada. So a few thoughts about key ideas and resources to take next steps, and let me turn it over to Robin.
Thank you, Peter. Yours is a great list, and I'll try not to repeat too much of that. But I just wanted to tell you about a couple of thoughts that I've had and thinking about going forward, and then maybe I'll make a couple of comments about the way in which we think ACAT can contribute to the ongoing work on learning outcomes in the Alberta system. I was interested to hear again and be reminded that the discussion of learning outcomes, particularly at the institutional level, is often about generic skills and those kinds of outcomes. And both Trudy's lists of outcomes and certainly the lists of outcomes that Jim gave us from the 2 rounds of work on that at Mount Royal were about generic skills, as I'll use the shorthand. And I guess I wonder how that connects or computes with or interacts with an academic discourse, at least in the transfer world, which is overwhelmingly about skills, training, and employment. Not so much about, and I know that generic outcomes aren't connected with those, but that's not the discussion, and to a large extent. And the programs and areas that see themselves as particularly the purveyors of generic skills certainly feel like they're under assault in our academic institutions at the moment. So what's the connection or the synergy or lack of there? Yes, Jeff, we did get to assessment, and I hope that was helpful. My understanding of some of the origins of learning outcomes and assessment was work done in the United States with college students, which purported to show that they weren't learning anything from year 1 to year 2 and so on. And Trudy's pointed out that research is invalid and those are not assessment methods that we use anymore. I guess that says to me we also need to be thinking about assessing the assessment. We need to be flexible about checking to make sure that the assessment methodologies that we're using are valid. I really enjoyed the conversation that there was around course outlines leading to the notion that programs are more than the sum of the course parts. I thought that was a great conversation. A couple of people have mentioned, and Sandy picked up on it in her comments, but I wanted to say something again about the student interest, and I'll, if my colleagues will forgive me, I'm going to tell a little tale out of school. But we had a fascinating discussion in the organizing committee for this conference towards the end of it. When we were writing up the original documents for this conference, we wanted to call it Student Learning Outcomes in Alberta. And then there was discussion about whether the word student should be there. And the issue was broader than that. But I think it's the student interest is still a really interesting and important one. It's certainly fundamental to the work that ACAT does. So in the tables that I visited, at least, I heard a lot of conversation about the institutional interest, the faculty interest, the system interest, the quality assurance interest, and actually less about the student interest. So I was glad you raised it again towards the end. It's fabulous to have students as part of this, and I just loved it when one of the student reporters got up and said, surely student success should be the ultimate motivator. And certainly at some institutions, student success is a motivator for faculty. But all that we do is pointless if we're not producing better education and better educated students. And that, it still seems to me that that's pretty fundamental. Someone somewhere in the discussion made the connection between K-12 and the post-secondary system, and that's certainly something that I think we need to pay more attention to, and it's certainly something that's part of ACAT's mandate that we need to pay more attention to. And so that takes me to ACAT, and I just wanted to mention a couple of things. One is the one I mentioned at the beginning, and that is our project on the Learner Pathways Modernization Initiative. So we will, when we roll out that new system of carrying out transfer, making transfer agreements, there will be a very obvious opportunity, as I said at the beginning of the day, not mandatory, but an opportunity to indicate the outcomes and courses and programs as you bring them forward for transfer. And the other contribution I think that ACAT can make is around the question of, there's been a fair amount of discussion of faculty engagement, as there should be. And thanks for your comment, Neil. We were aware as we were putting this conference together that we were calling together a conference or a workshop of university administrators, and we thought that was the place to start. But your point is a good one, certainly for the future. But ACAT also has a process around that. So for the last 2 or 3 years, we've been building a number of articulation committees. And those are committees in which faculties in their discipline get together and talk about programs and transfer and how it's working between the institutions. And some of those committees are engaging around learning outcomes. The math committee is a particular case in point. They're talking about learning outcomes, common first-year programs in certain areas, and connecting with British Columbia. And we've just had some additional capacity added to the Secretariat at ACAT that will enable us to build more of those articulation committees. And I think we have about 20 or so right now, and we need to build more. And I think those committees, those faculty-based committees, are a way of engaging faculty. You'll all be doing that within your institution, but that's a way of engaging faculty across the system in their disciplines. So those are my thoughts and comments and things to think about as we move forward. With that, I'm just going to call on Art Quinney, who's the co-chair of the Quality Council, who wishes to have the last word.
Thanks, Robin, and thank you for keeping us on time. We are 1/2 hour away sooner than was projected. I would like to recognize some people and institutions who have made today possible and the success that it's been. Thank you to you, the participants, for being here, particularly our students as well, and to our resource people. Everyone has shared, and it's been really a very successful opportunity for all of us to learn. We're all students. So thank you to all of you. Mount Royal for hosting. Wonderful facility. They've done a great job for us, so thank you to Mount Royal. It is a pleasure to really be here. Alberta College of Art and Design for the recording, which will be in posterity on at least 2 websites that I know, maybe more. Members of the organizing committee, we recognized them this morning. There was a lot of heavy lifting that was done by this group on, to a large extent, much of their own time. The secretariats of both CAQC and ACAT, really heavy lifting. They're the ones who did a lot of the work that you benefited and we benefited from today. Lastly, our 2 co-chairs, Peter and Robin, thank you. I know that this was work outside of a lot of the things that you normally do, and we appreciate it. So I'm going to ask you to join me in thanking all of you and the others who have made today possible. We're finished. Safe home.
And hand your surveys in.
And hand your surveys in.